The Cipher Brief, because national security is everyone's business.
Hi there, and welcome to the Cipher Brief series on artificial intelligence. We are coming to you from McLean, Virginia today as the Cipher Brief is on the move. So I'm sure a lot of you are missing our famous Cipher Brief bookcase. It is our great pleasure to be welcoming today Gilman Louis, and the timing could not be better for this conversation. Again, I'm Cipher Brief CEO Suzanne Kelly, and I'm here with Brad Christian. Many of you also know our Chief Marketing Officer, Alicia Volpe. I'd like to thank them for their support for helping to make this happen today as well. All right, so if you've been following the news at all, particularly news on AI, or if you've read this morning's free Cipher Brief newsletter, you already know that the U.S. Senate voted yesterday to pass the U.S. Innovation and Competition Act. Now, it's designed to direct nearly $250 billion into research and development in technology over the next 5 years. It's a move that many see as critical to future U.S. national security, particularly as it relates to the United States and China. And I'd like to share with you some of the comments as the news came out that the Senate had passed this measure today and what it means. Dr. Eric Schmidt and former Undersecretary of Defense, former Deputy Secretary for Defense Robert Work, both of whom lead the National Security Commission on Artificial Intelligence, issued a statement on this. They both said that, I want to read it to you, the United States is in a global technology competition. Our economic competitiveness and national security both hinge on the outcome of this competition. The National Security Commission on Artificial Intelligence's final report calls for a national strategy to reorganize the government, reorient the nation, and rally our closest allies and partners to defend and lead in the coming era of AI and emerging technology-enabled competition and conflict. They also said that Senate passage of the bipartisan U.S. Innovation and Competition Act is a giant step in this direction, with provisions enhancing commercially applicable investments in R&D at DARPA, NSF, and the NIST, and a renewed focus on reinvigorating our domestic semiconductor industry. It will surely improve U.S. technological competitiveness and help America retain its technological edge. They're urging the House to follow suit now and pass this critical piece of legislation without delay to ensure a more secure and prosperous future, as they put it, for the American people. We're going to welcome another member of that commission, Gilman Louis, to talk about what this means next in terms of investment in the future of AI. But first, I'd like to thank our sponsor, Microsoft Federal, for making today's session possible. If you're a Cipher Brief regular, you know how important it is, how much focus we put on this relationship between the public and private sectors and actually achieving what we need to when it comes to future national security. And with that, I'd like to welcome Doug Keating. He's a senior director with Microsoft Federal, and he's joining us now to share a few thoughts. Doug leads one of Microsoft's large prime cloud contracts that enables federal government customers to accomplish their missions. He also focuses on the intelligence community. Prior to joining Microsoft, Doug worked at Booz Allen Hamilton for over 15 years, and thank you very much, Doug, you're a veteran. He served in the U.S. Army for a decade as an infantry and signals corps officer. Doug, welcome. It's a big day to be talking about AI.
Thanks, Suzanne. Yes, definitely. And we at Microsoft appreciate the opportunity to partner with the Cipher Brief on this AI webinar series. It's been fantastic so far. And as a technology company, Microsoft's pleased to contribute to the conversation. And I'm just going to share a few thoughts as far as today's topic, investing in AI. Microsoft continues to invest heavily in AI technology, and we're all in when it comes to enabling the intelligence community mission. We've invested billions of dollars building cloud platforms across multiple classification levels that the community will be able to leverage to build AI solutions. We're encouraged particularly by 3 positive trends we see across the community regarding AI investment. Number 1, multi-cloud. We believe the intelligence community moving to multi-cloud is absolutely the right strategy for accelerating cloud adoption. Simply put, multi-cloud is going to enable rapid adoption of AI solutions across the community. With the award of the C2S follow-on contract, IC mission customers now have more options, better capabilities, and competition. All good things. Number 2, commercial solutions. We hear increased interest from federal agencies wanting to learn from our commercial customers regarding the best way to implement cloud-based AI solutions. For example, CarMax is a successful commercial cloud customer who's used our Azure platform to develop AI-based solutions that are changing the game when it comes to the car sales industry. After re-architecting all of their IT platforms, CarMax now employs over 500 data scientists. I'll say that number again because that's a big number. 500 data scientists who analyze the used car market using AI to create competitive advantage for their company. Just imagine what would happen if each IC agency did something similar. The third is new companies. Several intelligence community customers are using creative methods to engage and identify new potential partners to help solve the toughest mission problems. A good recent example, Emerging Business Day, sponsored by Margaret Augustine's office. This unclassified virtual event generated huge interest with over 500 companies registered and 1,000 attendees. As you might imagine, many of the companies that participated were AI focused, and most of them, they're new. They have not supported the agency before. Representatives from two of the largest directorates, DDI and DS&T, briefed as part of that session, talking about their toughest challenges, and AI was definitely top of the list for both of them. We at Microsoft, we're super excited as far as what the community will be able to accomplish when they get their hands on this technology, as more clouds and AI platforms come online in the coming months and years. We see exciting days ahead for the intelligence community. Back to you, Suzanne.
Doug, thanks very much for that. I appreciate it. And I think you touched on a couple of key things that I'm interested in diving in on with Gilman as well. So thanks very much to you, and thanks for Microsoft Federal support for this series. We appreciate it. All right, with that, I'd like to introduce our guest. Gilman Louis is a Cipher Brief expert, I'm so proud to say. He is also co-founder and partner of Alsop Louis Partners. From 1999 until 2006, he was the first CEO of InQtel. That's an independent, nonprofit venture capital firm that was established with the backing of the Central Intelligence Agency. Louis is an active advisor to this day to the intelligence community and is a member of the National Security Commission on Artificial Intelligence. He's also a consultant to the Defense Innovation Board for the Department of Defense. Gilman, welcome.
It's great being here, Suzanne.
It's great having you here. You know, we have a number of Cipher Brief experts on this call today as well, and broadly speaking, we are all interested in how the public and private sector need to be thinking about partnering, as Doug referred to in his comments, particularly about investing in AI. And we should start perhaps with the latest move by the Senate yesterday. Cipher Brief expert Robert Cardillo is wondering what you think of this measure and whether it's the right prescription.
It is clear that we are in a strategic competition. And that strategic competition is being set forth as a key strategy that China is placing its bets on helping their country reemerge as a global leader. Anybody who's a student of Chinese history will realize, besides their 3,000-year history, that there was this period of time in this dark era of their recent history that they call the period of humiliation, where they kind of missed out on the third industrial revolution. And as a central planning nation, they kind of looked around and said, if we're going to be a world power again, we need to emerge by being a leader in what they call the fourth industrial revolution, which are things like AI, 5G networks, advanced computing, quantum computing, bio, and a number of other key areas. And they have set a pretty rigorous timetable. They've said, at least with AI, that they will be competitive with the West by 2025, that they will lead by 2030 in AI, and by 2049 on the military front, be able to prosecute in any domain, anywhere in the world, and not just survive, but prevail. So they set that timetable. The US and the West can choose to compete or choose to ignore that. But our report points out that if we do so, we'll leave the nation at great risk. So I think the Senate realized in a bipartisan fashion that we cannot just let random events be our strategy, that we actually need a national strategy, as we pointed out in our report. and the time is ticking, and we have a very prescriptive framework on how the U.S. using democratic values and our great approach to innovation can not only compete but remain a leader in this space, and not be in a situation where the rest of the world, including ourselves, will have to rely on key technologies and platforms which do not necessarily reflect our values. And so that's where the strategic competition comes in. And what's really interesting is if you pull apart the resolutions, were they actually plussed up fundings and targeted, key initiatives or innovations like microelectronics are all reflected in the commission's report, right? Down to the importance of maintaining 2 generations ahead in microelectronics, to the doubling down on DARPA and NSF, to add a technology component to our strategy. These are all critical steps if we want to maintain our leadership world in these key pieces of technology, which are foundational to how we perceive society is going to operate in the future.
Yeah, and I think you touched on some of the strengths, and when it comes to China, it's not an equal playing field. Having trouble talking today, and they can sort of they have a lot more resources available at their disposal because of the nature of the way their government operates than the U.S. However, the U.S., I know you've always said in the past, one of our biggest strengths as a country and our national security is our private sector. So do you think that this bill with the Senate sort of laying some of these recommendations out and taking a move on this measure, which we hope passes the House and gets signed into law, is it enough of a first step, Gilman, or what else needs to be happening at the same time? Because it's a very broad picture. And as you said, there's a lot at risk here.
Yeah, and it's a very first important step that we take. So we outline in our report 4 key parts of our strategy, right? The first one is leadership. That's the leadership of the Congress, the leadership of the executive branch, right? And hopefully the leadership of our commercial companies to say, we need a national strategy. We are committing our resources. This is a whole nation approach, right? To not just understand this technology, but use it for the good of society. The Senate was the first step in that leadership component, but there are 3 other components that are necessary in order for us to implement the strategy. The second part of this is talent. Right? We need, and it's not just the computer scientists and data scientists that Doug were talking about. They are critical, but everyday people on how we use AI in our everyday lives. How do we trust it? How do we team with it? When do we use it? When shouldn't we use it? Where are the ethical considerations? What's good AI versus not so good AI? What is responsible use versus irresponsible use? Those things we need to work through, and we require talent who understands how to use this. And what is interesting, when we started the AI Commission 2 years ago, I remember seeing my very first AI commissioner meeting, and my wife texted me this. She goes, "Oh, great, Gilman, you're going to have this meeting. Share this with your other commissioners." And what she was sharing with me was a picture of a kindergarten textbook from China about AI. They are all in, and they are early, right? So talent is key. The second part of that is low. Most of the algorithms, not all, but most of the algorithms are publicly available. Right? So the 2 things that power up AI besides the algorithms, data, right, and hardware. And so one of the key areas that we really focused in on in our report, and the Senate focused in on in the resolution, was the importance of us being able to take control of the supply chain of chips and microelectronics. Why is that? Well, the most advanced foundries are in Korea and in Taiwan, right? Those are the engines that produces, the next generations of chips that we depend on to drive next generation AI. It's
Mhm.
110 miles away, right, from the closest Chinese missile battery, right, that could take that out. If they
Mhm.
took that out, we would lose not just our ability to produce Ford 150s, right? We lose the infrastructure necessary to keep us ahead and do that computing. So we understand for the efficiency of supply chains why we moved it offshore, and we didn't want to make the investments, and the Taiwanese wanted to do it. Great. Why should we do that? We just buy it from them. Now we're in this situation where we realize, particularly post-pandemic, right? We know, this is not just PPE. This is like the 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 brains in which all this software is going to run on. We need our own capacity to be able to produce these important pieces of microelectronics here in the U.S. And the last part that I think is really critical is innovation, right?
Mhm.
We need to double down on innovation, and we need to understand the science. We need to make these investments. We recommended over $40 billion worth of investments. The Senate kind of met us and took it to the next step. Again, all necessary moves if we want to achieve a goal of maintaining our competitiveness in AI against other nation states through 2025.
That's such a
But it's a
great,
down payment. It's a down
yeah,
payment.
and it's also such a great way to kind of sum up the playing field, if you will, and kind of help us understand what a broad strategy needs to look like. It can't
Right.
just be spending. It has to be sort of spending and investing in the talent, as you said, and investing in innovation, which is something you're very good at. So let me get to a question from General Joe Votel for you, Gilman, who says, what is the lesson learned from In-Q-Tel, from your time heading In-Q-Tel, regarding our challenges in harnessing emerging technology, much of which is coming from small business?
Well, I think there's several lessons we can learn. So lesson number one, it isn't easy. It's In-Q-Tel, the giving away money part is relatively straightforward, right? And so I know there are a lot of other federal agencies and other institutions out there. Well, we'll just create an In-Q-Tel, right? But it took 6 years of hard work, right? Of working with federal agencies like the Central Intelligence Agency and NGA and the other three-letter agencies, right, to build not just a foundation of trust of the technologies being produced by these startups, but to integrate the technologies actually into the workflows of the people doing the work, right? So you can make a lot of money, you can hire a lot of investors out there, but again, the goal for government is faster turns of technology and integration into products and services and workflow that affect our ability to prosecute our mission. I think the second lesson that we should learn is we can't do it by ourselves. We need partners. For every dollar that In-Q-Tel invests in a particular piece of technology or company, $13 of other people's money, usually other venture funds, but other investors' money follow. Why is that? Well, it turns out In-Q-Tel's value isn't its money. It isn't even its ability to do fast contracting. What everybody realizes the value of In-Q-Tel is identifying real hard problems that the government has that are predictors of market opportunities ahead of the market. So back in 1999, we were thinking about, language translation. We were thinking about advanced search engines. We were looking at, biosciences. We were doing cybersecurity. All before, we were thinking about cloud before there was cloud. So, and the other VCs resonate with that, and the startups resonate with that. Why? Because not only can we predict the future based on today's government's, challenges, but we also provide first customers. So companies can get their flywheel going. They can have a first customer. I mean, Palantir's first customer was, when Peter Thiel and Alex came to our offices and say, hey, we got this technology from PayPal, how can we apply it to the intelligence? We said terrorist financing. So they went off and worked for 2 years solving that class of problems. It turns out very similar problems that banks and other institutions have, and they built their business off of that, right? So
Mhm.
we have story after story of this. The value is the problem set.
I think that's fantastic. And, Doug mentioned in his comments right off the top as well that there are so many new opportunities and there are so many new companies that are trying to get into sort of this market and be a part of the solution when it comes to AI and keeping America's advantage in it. But Gilman, because you've worked in government long enough, that a big sort of problem is often the acquisition process. I mean, are we somehow like fast tracking things like AI, where there's such a critical component to if we get it wrong, how much it's going to impact national security? Or what are some of the secrets that you tell a lot of the heads of these small companies as they're getting started and how to sort of get into this and get in front of people with their ideas and their technologies?
Well, first of all, my heart goes out to anybody in the federal acquisition,
Yeah.
teams out there. I mean, they're hardworking professionals who are take the responsibility of our nation seriously, and they're very forthright in making sure that taxpayer dollars are not wasted. Okay.
Yeah.
But the structures in which we have thought about acquisitions, as it's defined in that 15 or 1600 pages of the FAR, Federal Acquisition Regulations, or the DFARs, right? I mean, it's like a Bible, right, or telephone book. And the challenges we had when we looked at the FAR was the realization that FAR was designed for buying physical things, big systems.
Yeah.
Buy an F-35 or an F-16 or a tank or an aircraft carrier or building a building, right? Or even buying computer servers. It does a pretty good job of that. And the cycle times, which is, the cycle time of the Department of Defense is these kind of 1 year, right, or 4-year palm cycles and 1 year, contracting cycles. That's all tuned towards buying things. What it's not particularly good at is, it's good about buying atoms. It doesn't buy electrons very well, right? We wrote a report out of the Defense Innovation Board, the DIB, right? That says, basically software never ends. And software needs to be thought very differently than hardware. You can imagine if we only updated your iPhone or your Android phone once every 4 years. Well, that's what a block upgrade is like. We're going to update the system. The software's 4 years old, right? Okay, so we'll do a big block upgrade. It's continuous. So what we did in the DIB, and everybody thought we were tilting at windmills. We had a 1-year program. We went in, and Alan Lord at the time was our sponsor with support from Mike Griffin. Said, let's go reinvent this. Let's make ourselves in the department software oriented. So we went in, we brought our best minds to industry to put together our best minds in government to come up with, modern acquisition approaches for software. We talked a lot about how software is developed, and we did one thing that nobody thought was possible. In 1 year, we changed the color of money for software. When I say color of money, for those not in acquisition field, money is allocated for, specific lanes for development, for purchasing, for maintenance, for support in the long tail. We needed to create a color for money because we said software permeates across all of those stages horizontally, right? And it needs to be thought of as fuel, as like gas that powers up your car. And AI is part of that, right? Because a lot of AI is driven by software or cloud services that you can buy from great companies like Microsoft, right? That we don't have to reinvent that stuff in the department, right? But we need to buy it like the way we buy gas and electricity. And so we structured an environment to do so. So that's a long way of saying, look, there's a lot of stuff about FAR reform. There's other transaction authorities. The IC has Section 8 authorities. And lots of people are being creative, but at the end of the day, we needed a different color of money. We did it.
I think that makes a lot of sense. Okay, Cipher Brief expert Ambassador Joe Jatrani says China's AI guru Kai-Fu Lee maintains that China has already caught up to the US in AI. And he says, given all the data that China has access to, will remain a world leader in AI. Joe's question is, do you think that China, with significant support from their central government, can catch up and possibly overtake the US in the application of AI for national security pursuits. So you mentioned China's sort of calendar off the top here, Gilman. How realistic is it? And are you buying into that as well?
Well, Kai Fu's a smart guy, right? I mean, he worked at Google, right? He wrote the famous book. He talked a lot about China's advantage over the U.S. And what I would say is it's a very Chinese-centric view. It's not a wrong view, it's just their view. But if you take apart AI, and let's pull apart the AI stack, right? There's components within AI that makes AI. So everybody talks about the algorithms, right? I would say the US is ahead of China on the algorithms. The caveat is a lot of algorithms are open source. The Chinese are very good at leveraging open source, just like the rest of the world is. That's why it's called open source. Right. But if you look at a lot of the work that's being done in algorithmic development, a lot of that's being done by the US. It's not just the US, Canada, the UK, Europe, they're working on that. But the US is a real leader, right? Data, China does have the advantage, right? Because they don't care about privacy. It's not their mandate. I mean, China's worried about security and harmony because they've been around for 3,000 years and had multiple revolutions. They like individual rights. Well, we worried about that. We might not be around for 3,000 years. So their worried is, inside out, outside in, somebody disrupting what is their status quo. So that's their priorities. And so they collect a lot of data, but that data is Chinese data. Right? So their facial recognition software is really good at determining my face from my wife's face, but other ethnicities, not so good. But it is our concern that if China moves out and becomes the platform for the world, right, then they'll be good at those other things. And this is not about Chinese containment. But again, their sensibilities are different than ours. So their citizens they feel they take a national pride that they're willing to share all their data. There's national pride to have individuals having social scores. It's totally un-American. It's undemocratic, right? We respect the right of privacy. The Chinese go, what are you trying to hide? So that's where those platform cultures kind of go up against each other. They may have a short-term data advantage, like because of their smart cities and things that they're doing, but they don't necessarily have a global data advantage, right? I mean, if they have a challenge here in the US, they're going to have 10 times the challenge in the EU, right? Talent side, right? We're ahead of talent on the very top. Top 2%, our top 2%, I would say, is better than their top 2%. Though they have brilliant people as well. We, because of our great universities, our great research facilities, our great companies, right? We have the flywheel going. They're trying to get theirs going, but they have scale. They just got more people, more engineers than we do. So the next 8%, they can make a pretty good argument that the next 8% is on par, if not better than our next 8%, right? And that's that talent part we really have to think about. Now, the other areas, applications, Chinese are unrestricted on applications. And with military civil fusion, they can take those applications that are being sold for, like TikTok, and apply that same AI in military systems, right? The US doesn't have march-in rights. We can't march into Microsoft and say, you know what? Civil military fusion, all this stuff you're doing for us, we don't care what your employees think. We're just taking it away. That's your responsibility. That's the difference in the culture. So, and the last part is the integration, right? The smart cities and stuff. This is the commitment. They started in 2016 with a national commitment to roll out. And we were asleep at the switch, right? We are now trying to play catch up in 5G, for example, right? We do not want to be in that same position with AI.
A question here from Cipher Brief expert Paul Colby. You know Paul, don't you? He's running the intelligence project up at Harvard's Belfer Center. He says, since human tagging and categorization at scale is such an important part of teaching machines to recognize what only humans know, does that give China an insurmountable advantage given the human labor resources that they've devoted to this, which you've already touched on a little bit?
Now, we had to understand that much of what we think about data requirements and harvesting of data and tagging data is not necessarily grounded in AI per se, is grounded in the field around machine learning, which is a subset of AI.
Mm-hmm.
And that's how we do it today because that's where the technology is. But this is, Eric Schmidt and I were talking the other day, and we said, like, it's hard to predict in 1915 what air travel was going to be like based on the state of airplane technology in 1915. And if you
Yeah.
think about AI technology today, even though this is the third iteration of AI, right, the third attempt, and we're getting a lot of traction this time versus the expert systems of the past,
Mm-hmm.
the applications of machine learning, this narrow AI, right, will have severe limitations. It's brittle. There's many other approaches being researched today. This is why in the AI Commission we said we need to double down on R&D, right?
Mm-hmm.
The Chinese are really good at taking existing technology and applying it very quickly in that OODA loop fashion, very fast, right? Right, but inventing new approaches, they're not quite there yet with the West. We need to double down in our research to be able to look at what's beyond ML, what's beyond human tagging. How
Mm-hmm.
can we train systems with less data and more observations? So there are different approaches to approach this. This week, the Chinese have the advantage of a lot more people to tag, but
Mm-hmm.
that's like in, 1915, the ability to produce a superior propeller may not really be pertinent in air travel today.
Mm-hmm. Okay, here's a question kind of sticking a little bit on that topic. Jeff Kohler asks, are there any initiatives in process now to create a sophisticated yet standardized cybersecurity protocol for all AI technology, one that's not easily hacked by ransomware criminals or terrorist actors, because that's a whole nother mess we're dealing with at the moment?
Well, cyber is a big issue, right? And it cuts across all things. There's IT, IO, SCADA systems, right? Next generation technologies like AI. How's that going to butt up against cyber? Disinformation we don't think of as cyber, but turns out to be cyber power, but will be a critical tool to defeat our adversaries' AI. We call it adversarial AI, which is basically giving malign information to machines so that we can negatively train these machines. So it's more than just getting a chat bot say something that's stupid, but actually create vulnerabilities there. Those are all different lines. So there's not going to be one solution, one standard that's going to protect us. I think it's going to be like an onion. It's going to be multiple layers. One of the recommendations that we made in our report is the appropriate funding of NIST to
Yes.
think through what should those standards be that will make AI less brittle, less susceptible to cyber attacks, right? As well as beginning to think through with our allies, because part of the strategy is working with partners. So what should be the testing environment for testing, evaluation, validation, and verification, which is going to be critical. Look, the Russians are happy to write a piece of AI and throw it out in the battlefield, and it might work, right? And we saw that in Syria. And it's sort of like, that should not be the standard of any responsible nation, even our competitors or potential adversaries, to just throw stuff out into the world without any sort of testing and validations, particularly systems that are potentially lethal. So thinking through that environment, thinking through new testing tools, right, that will help us make things more robust, more secure, are all parts of those layers of those onions that we need to start investing in. But I will say that security around AI is going to be more challenging, will represent new kinds of barriers that we're going to have to figure out how to overcome, that goes beyond standard cybersecurity.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought up the testing and validation component too, because that's something that there's a lot of focus on, as you know, inside the Beltway in Washington right now. And we're proud to say we talked with Jason Matheny about it in the very first edition of this series earlier this year. And Jason has now been pulled into government to help the Biden administration think through kind of their approach to testing and validation as well, and a lot of the issues that you brought up. Jeffrey Harris has a question. He says, we accept and understand human strengths and shortfalls in decision making. are we going to be as generous with AI-driven decision recommendations? So talking more about sort of what happens once this is applied and having these machines make these decisions. What are the potential shortfalls, and how worried are you that there are going to be some really significant shortfalls?
Well, the way you should think about it is AI is like a catalyst. Right? It allows you to do things much faster at scale than you could without those kinds of systems. And your traditional rule-based computing systems are just plain old humans. But as an amplifier, it means that it can amplify bad decisions much more efficiently. Right?
Great.
So when it makes a mistake, it makes a lot of them really, really fast, right? And we can see that in systems, right? Where AI generally is safer than human-driven systems until it fails. And then where it fails, it tends to be catastrophic on the other side, right? Whereas humans kind of fail more gracefully, and there's enough time to recover, right? And there's diversity in the humans because it's a because we're all different. We're humans, right? We're heterogeneous. Homogeneous systems, right? When they fail together at scale and at speed. So we got to be particularly careful. This is why the TEVV, testing, evaluation, validation, verification component is so important. Second part, training humans to work with machines and training machines to work with humans. I mean, we were seeing this play out. Now, I'm in San Francisco right now. We see it play out on 280 every day where people are using self-driving cars. But so here's the problem with self-driving cars, the challenge. And we're going to say problems, right? If you let every car be self-driving, it's clear to me that we will be safer than allowing humans to drive by themselves. So generally, we're at that point now where, these systems are better than, on average, a human controller. Okay, now, here's the problem with these systems. They have to interoperate in a world where they don't know who's operating the other vehicles. It could be a human. It could be a human who's reading their iPhone while driving the car, even though they're not supposed to. Even if your hands on wheel and you flip on the autopilot and you're paying attention, right? But human brains begin to shut down if there's, if it's familiar patterns. It's like there's nothing unusual here, nothing unusual here. The AI is in control until it's not. The red light flashes, that steering wheel shakes, your mind is wandering off. It takes you 2 seconds, if you're really fast, to react. Well, how far does your car travel in 2 seconds if you're traveling 60 miles an hour down 280 into the truck in front of you? So that human machine interface, that teaming, we got a lot of work to do on that because it's not just about making really smart systems.
Yeah, it's great that we see these innovative leaders and these companies investing in this technology, though, and testing it and trying to move us further down that, no pun intended, road. But we've gotten a few questions, Gilman, related to China's corner on the rare earth minerals market and what risks that represents to our technology and the race that we're in. Perhaps you can comment a little bit on rare earth minerals and how we should be thinking about that.
Well, let's understand why China is a leader in rare earth minerals. Generally, there are some certain exceptions. Rare earths aren't that rare. It's just how willing are you to rip up your environment, right? Tear apart your ecology to get to those rare earths. Again, China is trying to ascend up the curve. It's less important for them to preserve the ecological environment, or their citizens are kind of like, they don't mind a big hole in the ground next to them or the toxic stuff in the air. So that's challenge number one, right? It's sort of like they're there because the way we get to them is so corrosive to the environment. So a couple of things to think about. Is there better ways to mine rare earth elements that we'll be willing in the West to use that the Chinese really don't care about? If not, there are other approaches. The Japanese have created alternatives, right, on certain rare earth elements to find substitutes, right, synthetic responses, not perfect solutions, but there are ways to kind of work around some of the rare earths. The way things are, they have an advantage, right? I mean, it's sort of like the early days with titanium and the Russians, right? I mean, the Soviets. It was a very similar sort of thing. But I don't think it's going to be a long-term problem, but it is definitely a short-term challenge.
Something to
And
keep
by the way, just like the way the Russians were using the gas line as a, like, if you don't vote my way in Europe, I'm going to shut off your gas line, and it's a raise prices. You got some of that happening with China, and like when they were kind of in that dispute with the Japanese and holding back rare earths. I mean, it's a challenge, but at the end of the day, there's one thing about China is they're still economics driven, right? So this is more of a military problem than it is a commercial problem in the midterm.
A question here that I love from our own Brad Christian, who you know well. Brad says, regarding the competition and the race, what are some of the indicators, I love this, that we should be watching for that will tell us how we're doing and what the timeline is for this competition, like 5, 10, 20 years down the road? Because if we're not sort of paying attention or watching the scoreboard, we may fall even further behind, is the fear, right?
But there's good competition and there's bad competition. So I'm not against competition. I think competition can be healthy if done right. Done wrong, you end up like in the Cold War, right?
Yeah.
We clearly don't. If we can avoid a Cold War, we should avoid it, right? Now, there's some people who say, well, this competition is artificially being manufactured by the U.S. I heard this a lot from my European allies. And it's sort of like, no, time out, guys. You don't get to like pick sides when it's convenient and stay in the middle or on the sidelines, right? You make that choice every day, right? If you put in a Huawei 5G network cell because it's cheaper on that tower, you made a choice, right? If you're okay with software, right, that is also used inside China, same software on the same phone that is used by their telcos to surveil for scoring, those algorithms are still in the phone. And while they might have turned it off, how would you ever really know, right? And so you make your choices every day. So that's number one. You look around and you say, on average, how are those technologies diffusing out of China? So the speed of the diffusion. And two, whether or not those systems are compliant with sensibilities and democratic values on the West, right? And then if you see lots of Chinese platforms moving out, but nobody knows what's going on the inside, right? And there's no alternative. I mean, a great example, I use the 5G a lot, right? It's sort of like, okay, Huawei was picked as their national champion, right? China decided to go off and build 600,000 base stations in a year, right? Nokia is trying to sell their base stations in the US, right? And you know, we have like 50,000 base stations. So now their engine is being revved up. And so when a country in Africa says, I want to buy a base station, it's not just about what's available or what's cheaper. They're 3 generations ahead of where we are. So the indicator is just looking at the market. The market's going to tell you whether or not you're ahead. And since most of these technologies are dual use, you can track many of these technologies by what's happening in the consumer electronics area, right?
Wow.
And the cloud platform. So if you start seeing dominated, wow, man, you know, that TikTok application is, or Alibaba application is so much better than the Amazon application, you better be worried.
So
right?
it's looking to the market for those indicators is fascinating.
Exactly right.
I wish I was as smart as you are, Gilman. I may need to. So what do you think? Like, what is the next thing that has to happen here? I mean, in terms of, you know, we kind of went through some of the things that you had recommended in the AI Commission report, which was fantastic, by the way. And if you haven't actually read that report, I really recommend you just Google it, go to the website for the commission and download the report and read it. But wait, before I just got interrupted via AI by someone I have a lot of respect for, Jim Clapper. He wants to know if you have any thoughts on using AI to help secure supply chains. You did mention before how important it is that we actually are able to do it. So Jim would like to know, how can we use AI around making those supply chains more secure?
Yeah, you know, we got to do a few things, right? And AI can definitely help us on supply chain planning,
Yeah.
anticipation, right, and prediction.
Mm-hmm.
Our
Mm-hmm.
problem of using and there are a lot of companies working on some great technologies around using AI and ML in supply chain.
Mm-hmm.
One of the challenges, it goes back to that data challenge, right, is that in order for us to do it, we need to put more sensors available in the supply chain to gather the data. You know, in the old days, I remember when FedEx was starting out, they used to give away free FedEx terminals. Why? Because that was their version of sensors,
Mm-hmm.
right? The more people who put more sensors out there will allow them to solve logistics problems because they can actually begin to model that. Well, we need to do that at a hyperscale, both on the cyber side and IT information, as well in the physical side. Second, like-minded companies and nations need to be willing to share information and not hoard their data, right? If
Mm-hmm.
everybody hoards their data, they cannot solve the supply chain challenges. Now, we've seen what cooperation looks like. We just went through it with COVID-19,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Yeah, we
Our
did.
supply chains were very brittle. They broke,
Yeah.
right? But what did people do? They started sharing. Nation states started working together, right? And we got through it. But we got through it by adapting, right? And beginning to open up and sharing that information. Still being competitive, you know, companies still were making money and things like that. But
Mm-hmm.
we, and it wasn't perfect, but it does show we can do it. So I think if we had the right sensors out there, the AI companies, you know, the big platform companies, Microsoft, Amazon, you know, Google, right? They have, you know, they have the compute infrastructure. It's a
Mm-hmm.
completely doable thing.
Mm-hmm. So basically, sensors and better information sharing
Yeah.
is a big fat cultural shift for American private sector is the idea, and we've seen it play out over, you know, we're more than a decade into the cyber conversation. Last year was the biggest year of ransomware. I don't even know where people like Kevin Mandia and Brad Smith would place this year in the ransomware category, probably outdoing last year, but we haven't learned that lesson yet. So there's also a cultural component to understanding how we need to change the way we think and how we need to change the way we organize to sort of maintain that leading edge when it comes to AI, right? How are you going to tackle that?
Well, you know, there are a lot of smart people, and they just didn't show up last year or this year, right? That have been writing on this. I mean, take a look at the classic HB at Harvard Business School, right? A professor around strategy, Michael Porter. Well, Michael
Mm-hmm.
Porter talked about clusters, right? The importance of local clusters becoming economic engines, and you know, where you have universities, you have availability of capital, you have talent, you have infrastructure to be able to create things, right? So what I would say is both for department leaders, agency leaders, and corporate leaders, and even institutions like universities, they need to start thinking about ecosystems,
Mm-hmm.
right? Stop being so short-sighted and say, you know, I compete against you because I'm selling product, you know, competitive products.
Mm-hmm.
Why don't we first make sure that there's a market for all of our products
Mm-hmm.
and work together to make sure there's nobody who could throw a wrench in our systems, because there's a unity of effort here, right? Like the banks have kind of done it, right? The banks are very good at sharing information across the big banks and down to the little banks if there's cyber things happening in their banking system. So, you know, I'll go to JP Morgan or Morgan Stanley or Goldman Sachs, and I talk to the CISOs out there. They feel responsibilities, not just we're being attacked. We know that the adversary attacking us can't get in. They'll just go downstream and keep going till they get in. So they, you know, they created this kind of interchange of information and this ISAC, and they basically share information. Why? Because it creates a safer ecosystem. So we need the cultural shift here is, quite frankly, this is kind of what we told our kids when they were growing up. Stop thinking about just yourself, right? Think about your friends, right?
Yeah.
And if you are willing to share appropriately, right? The benefits is to everybody.
Yeah, it's those basic lessons that just apply in everything. But let me ask you now, I mean, we've seen, you know, over the last decade or so, this change, a slow change, I would say, from Silicon Valley thinking when it comes to sort of their goals with innovation, R&D, and selling and reaching customers in China and not being held back in order to reach that market by governments and policies that aren't convenient. But their initial approach to sort of national security was like, hey, that's your thing. Have you seen a shift lately, Gilman, in this with more of the focus on AI, with more of the focus on ML and the understanding of how it is going to impact that ecosystem that you talked about? Are you seeing any change in the thinking out there? You're in San Francisco.
Yeah, well, first of all, because we all love watching television or cable or online Netflix, right? So we kind of think of, we turn our favorite Silicon Valley comedy and we say, well, that's what Silicon Valley looks like, right?
Yeah.
So here's one thing that's really important. We discovered this at Incutel. There is no ubiquitous thinking that everybody on the West Coast thinks one way and everybody in the Beltway thinks another. There's a lot of diversity, even within these great companies. Like if I ever suppose employees at Microsoft or Google or Amazon, there will be a huge diversity of thought. Now, corporately, they may project a particular image, but there is not universal agreement even within inside those companies. So now it's a question of leadership, right? This goes back to the pillars, corporate leadership. And look, there is a lot of good discussion about the appropriate uses of these technologies and things like military systems. And I think that debate makes us American. And that's a good debate. And companies can choose to do it or not do it. And some companies like Microsoft, right? They said, look, if you object to your working on a project with DoD, we're happily transfer you to some other place within the company. You don't have to deal with it, right? We only want, people who feel, that they're comfortable with working on projects. That's a very forward way of applying leadership and choice. And that's what makes America America and not America China, right? I do not want to have military civil fusion. I think it's the wrong model. I think the Chinese picked their national champions far too early. Like, think about it. And no offense to Jerry Yang, and he did a great company in creating Yahoo. What would happen if the U.S. had the China approach back in the great search engine competition, and we declared Yahoo our national champion? Right? Would there be a room for a Google to emerge and pass them by? Right? The great part about kind of capitalism, democratic style is this creative destruction, right? There's a little bit of survival of the fittest, but at the same time, you pick too early, you're locked in. So I'm not sure. Look, it didn't help the Russians, the Soviets, by having these 5 and 10-year plans, right? Now the Chinese are more efficient, right? They have a much bigger capital base and they're very smart and they're run by technocrats and they know what they're doing. But it doesn't mean their model is going to win. And if I was a betting individual, which I am because I'm a venture capitalist, right?
Yes, you are.
I bet on our model, but our model does have to evolve. It can't be stagnant. We need to understand there's a competitor on the other side, very committed, very smart, with just as much resources that we have. We got a little bit ahead start, but they're ramping quickly. And if we get off our tushes, my goal is to, kind of look at China in the past, like the way we looked at Japan in the 1980s, where, remember all that, just say no inside China that, Japan was going to win. And they didn't. It's still a great economy, the 3rd largest economy in the world, but we're still the largest.
Yeah.
But the U.S. had to make a shift to compete with Japan. We're going to have to make a shift to compete with China.
Yeah. A quick one, I think. Okay, final question, and then I'm going to come to you for some closing thoughts on all this and just help us think about how to think forward on this issue and keeping in mind some of the indicators that you talked about. But here's a question first from Max Langenkamp, who says the most popular machine learning libraries are completely open source. How does the National Security Commission on Artificial Intelligence think about the role that open source software should play in the competition between the US and China? You already mentioned that China has a huge advantage because everything's out there.
Right. Well, look, I'm a big believer in open source because it's a quick diffusion. I mean, I give up a little bit because the Chinese can just use open source just like ourselves, right? But open source, right, foundationally gives us an ability for everybody to look at the code, everybody to share codes. It's a market of good ideas. Now, there are economies that are built around open source that mix proprietary with open source.
Mhm.
In the government, we might mix exquisite technologies where there's open source. If open source can move the ball forward in a way, in what I call it, in a responsible use way, that is foundational, then we in the government get to focus our exquisite capabilities on the exquisite.
Mhm.
It's a way, and this is the argument, the age-old argument between GOTS and COTS. You know, there's always somebody who will show up in my office and say, I'm just smarter than this company because I figured out how to do this widget a little bit better. And we should put, you know, we should buy the GOT solution than the COT solution. I said, time out, guys. Like, why are we wasting our efforts to create this unique solution, which we're going to have this long tail of support? This look, it's not, I'm sorry, I understand why you rather have the button on the upper right hand part of the screen in red and the commercial solution has it in the lower left in green, right? But get over it, right?
Yeah.
We're going to use our money on the things that the commercial world can't afford to, or we're going to use the money on exquisite capability that we're going to classify and make sure and protect that our competitors can't get access to. Use our dollars wisely, use our talent wisely, build exquisite where you need exquisite. Let the rest of the world go open source. Look, I invested in Keyhole, right? The ability to take satellite image and put it into a 3D thing. Today it's called Google Earth. Well, when we were sitting there at InQtel thinking about Keyhole, you know, one of our challenges is how do we populate the planet with the buildings and stuff like this? Well, and Google bought the company, right? And then they did what they did the commercial way. The government would like hire a bunch of contractors and start having people like build 3D models stick on the. What Google did is made it open, fundamentally made the platform available, open and free, and suddenly the rest of the world populated for us. So
Yeah.
got
Open
there
source.
faster and better than the
Yeah.
government could ever do it.
Gilman, closing thoughts as you think about this. I mean, the commission is still continuing on for a little while, I understand, and you're still very much in this game, and you will be after the commission goes away as well. But how should we be thinking about this moving forward? We're watching what's happening through the government. You've given us some really good indicators. You said look to the market to tell whether we're staying ahead or not, which I think is a fantastic takeaway for today. What are the other things top of mind for you that you want us to sort of keep focus on in the next coming months?
Well, I'll have two comments. Those in government and those for people who are not in government. For the folks in government, is this most likely isn't going to be about who has the slightly better AI, right? But who's willing to disrupt their way they do business every day, how they think about their problems, right? Some people just take AI and graph it upon what they're already doing, right? How do we make analysts a little bit more efficient? How do we have operators in the field be a little bit better, a little bit smarter? And then there will be organizations or maybe other nation states who will reimagine how they would do the entire intelligence circle or how they would prosecute, right, a fight in an AI-driven autonomous world. And my fear within the Department of Defense and within the intelligence community and greater within our US government is that we're going to protect what we've always done, the way we've always done it, and just incrementally tweak the system with this new tech. And our adversary is going to invent a whole new approach to use these technologies in a way that when we wake up one day, we're going to be on the wrong end of that spear. To the commercial companies, right? My view is don't wait, right? Grow your talent, acquire the best talent, build systems, right, that are usable. Build systems that you can explain how the AI made the decision. Why is that important? Because unless people have confidence in these systems, unless there's a level of transparency in these systems, people will not adopt. And if people don't adopt, it doesn't matter if you have the world's greatest system if nobody uses it. So commercial companies need to accelerate their rate of innovation, but they need to be very thoughtful about making it, how is it going to be used by everyday people? And on the government side, be willing to disrupt their existing institutions to have long-term strategic advantage over competitor nations.
Gilman, I think that's fantastic. I mean, you've given us some really clear ways of thinking moving forward, and it's so helpful to us. I can't thank you enough for this excellent brief. We're grateful to you for your time, to our sponsor, Microsoft Federal, for helping us bring this important briefing to this group of experts from both the public and the private sectors. We also want to remind everyone that we are going to continue these conversations with this series in Microsoft, and we'll have one more series coming up in July that we'll be announcing as well. So thank you so much, everyone, for joining us. Gilman, thank you. We really appreciate it.
But thank you for having me, and thank you for Microsoft for sponsoring this. We really appreciate it. Take care.
We just want to remind everyone, a quick logistics note again, that registration applications are now being accepted for the Cipher Brief Sea Island Conference. It's at the end of October. Gilman has been there before. We hope he's going to join us there again, October 24th to 26th. The seats are limited and it's invite only, not because we're snobs or we want to not be nice to people, but because we really curate this audience to make sure that folks from both the government and private sector who are in that room have a stake in the national security issue and have something to bring to the table in terms of their perspective, the diversity of innovation and things that Gilman has talked about. So if you're interested in being in that room with us in October, please check out tcbconference.com. Thank you guys very much, as always, for being with us. We're excited to see you again next time. Bye-bye.